Audio check. Okay, welcome back. We have asked if we can turn the ventilation off, so we'll see if we can get a bit warmer in here, but we'll see.
Okay, well, hopefully that will get sorted at some point
Yes.
soon. I think it's probably worse for you all than it is even for,
Yeah, there's
for the rest of us.
breeze at the back here, but,
Right.
anyway, you've got about 45 minutes left by my reckoning.
Yes,
Mr. Taylor.
I might be 10 minutes more than that, but
Okay.
it's going to be close.
Okay, we have got Mr. Renshaw in at 4 p.m.-ish, obviously, but we've got cross-examination to
Sure.
do.
All right,
Okay.
well, I'll press on then.
Yeah.
So we're turning to climate change now, and for that I wanted to start in Aviation 2050, which is CD 6.5, and page 76, Mr. Gertler.
Okay.
This is a page we looked at in the climate change section of the inquiry. And we can see here that that to implement the government's long-term vision and pathway for addressing UK aviation's impact on climate change, the government proposes to require planning application for capacity growth to provide a full assessment of emissions, drawing on all feasible cost-effective measures to limit their climate impact. And then it says this, and demonstrating that their project will not have a material impact on the government's ability to meet its carbon reduction targets. Now, has Bristol Airport Limited demonstrated that their project will not have a material impact on the government's ability to meet the 6th carbon budget target or net zero 2050?
No, they haven't, and Dr. Oates and Ireland accepted that in cross-examination.
In that regard, how relevant is it to consider the extent to which government has conducted a concluded assessment of the path to attainment with the 6th carbon budget for the aviation sector, or indeed the path to net zero 2050 for the aviation sector?
Well, the government hasn't conducted one, and therefore it's not possible for Bristol Airport Limited to demonstrate that it complies with the net zero or the 6th carbon budget.
Okay. Now, we looked earlier at policy CS1 of the core strategy at CD 5.06, and we want to remind ourselves of what it says. It's on page 24 of the PDF, and it refers to development demonstrating a commitment to reducing carbon emissions. In the context of the evidence that you just gave about a failure to demonstrate that the proposed development will not have a material impact on the ability to meet carbon reduction targets, well, what consequence does that have in terms of the application of this policy?
Well, it's contrary to this policy. Did the actual documents submitted show that it is increasing carbon emissions, but when you look at the net zero and 6th carbon budget, it's not achieving the carbon emission reductions that are required by this policy.
We've seen at this inquiry that the government went out to consultation on the Jet Zero documents, and we've spent some time looking at those. That consultation has now closed, as I understand it. What weight should the inspectors give to the Jet Zero consultation paper?
Well, it's finished consultation, so the government has to consider the responses that have been received, and then appraise those. I would say given that it's just finished and the government hasn't yet appraised the responses and set out the policies, there would be limited weight to be given to it.
Okay, thank you. You heard the evidence that Dr. Hinnells gave regarding the issues that the appraisal within that consultation paper gave rise to, and he described them as giving rise to some controversy. To what extent does that affect the weight that one should give to Jet Zero?
I can't remember if it was with Dr. Hinnells that you looked at MPPF paragraph 48, which was doing a similar analysis to what you might do with a development plan and the weight to give to it. So the stage of preparation has obviously been through the consultation. Dr. Hinnells obviously addressed issues that will come in as objections from different parties, no doubt. So the government will have to look at those and see whether they can resolve them. And then in terms of the weight, I would suggest that if you were to apply the sort of principles set out in paragraph 48 of the MPPF, you would be giving limited weight to it.
Yes, one of the points that Dr. Hinnells looked at was the extent to which the appraisal in Jet Zero was consistent with the statutory duties in Section 1 and Section 4 of the Climate Change Act 2008. And you remember his evidence about the extent to which the likelihood of the policy approach set out actually attaining the various climate change targets. To what extent is that relevant when considering the weight to give to Jet Zero?
It is relevant. I mean, there was obviously the discussion about the duty placed on the Secretary of State, but it is relevant in that the sixth carbon budget and net zero do set targets that need to be achieved. And if this development undermines those, then the government will have to weigh those up and to consider. It will be in the responses that are received.
All right. Now, Dr. Hinnells also raised a point concerning the concept of prematurity. Normally in planning, if we do consider prematurity, it's in the context of an emerging development plan. He drew our attention to NPPF paragraph 49 and sought to lift some relevant considerations when considering whether to grant planning permission for the expansion of Bristol Airport would be premature in the context of the formulation of national policy. Now, what weight do you give to the considerations that he identified in the planning balance in respect of prematurity?
Well, he did identify that. Effectively, he talked almost about a beauty contest, so that he suggested that you would need to identify all the airports that are coming forward, and I think he listed, Luton with its 1 million passengers. I think it was Leeds Bradford with 3 million or so. I can't remember what Southampton's 167 metre runway extension adds. Stansted's 8 million, and this 2 million. He said the government would end up needing to choose. And I think he gave the example that Stansted appeared to be almost on the basis of a first come, first served. If they come forward in a sort of ad hoc piecemeal way, and the government is formulating its policy and has the obligation to hit net zero by 2050, and then we've got the sixth carbon budget now in play as well, there would be an undermining of that, and it would be contrary, so it would appear to be premature if you were to use the sort of approach in paragraph 49 of the MPPF.
Thank you. So with those considerations in mind, what weight do you give to prematurity in the overall planning balance?
I would say it has some weight, that you have to consider it, you have to give it, I don't know that it's significant weight. If it undermines net zero and sixth carbon budget, probably it is significant weight to be given to it.
Okay. All right, let's move on from climate change to greenbelt considerations. We've already covered that pretty recently. We left to this week's session the overall balance to be struck, which is set out in paragraph, I think it's 48 now, of the MPPF. So let's just go through some of the factors that go into that balance. In terms of the factors that you put in the balance, firstly, whether there's a need for all of the land that's within the green belt, which is thought to be used for parking, to be so used. What is the conclusion you've come to, and how does that affect the balance that you've struck?
Well, the assessment would seem to, so if you looked at one, would be the public transport mode shift and the targets. That would suggest that if you were going for an ambitious target, you could get more people to be using the public transport, and the demand for car parking would go down. Therefore, the provision within the green belt could be reduced. The monitor and manage approach would also seem to suggest that if the airport doesn't need it now, there aren't very special circumstances. It has to be demonstrated that there is the need for the level of car parking it's got to be required. That doesn't appear to be the case if you can do a monitor and manage approach. So in terms of whether there is the need for all the car parking in the greenbelt, and despite Mr. Melling's evidence this morning, I remain to be convinced that they can't provide additional car parking within the GBI. But it would appear to me that there is not the demand to put all that car parking within the green belt, and the very special circumstances, I don't believe, have been demonstrated on that basis.
So we've got that element. We've got harm to openness by reason of inappropriateness. What weight do you give to that in light of the guidance in the NPPF?
So if you were looking at Cog Loop 1 and Cog Loop 2, they are inappropriate development within the green belt, and the NPPF says substantial weight.
And then in terms of the other harm, what are the elements of other harm that need to be taken into account?
We identified in my proof of evidence various ones, so it included noise, air quality, health, climate change, and surface access were the ones that I ran through before moving on to the greenbelt paragraph.
So you've got substantial weight associated with the harm to openness. Collectively, how much weight should be given to all those other elements of harm?
My proof of evidence does, in various paragraphs, ascribe significance or weight to the impacts. I would say, because of the conflict with policy, it's very significant.
And so, if we've got substantial weight to harm by reason of inappropriateness, very significant weight by reference to the other principal elements of harm, and your conclusion that it's not been established that all of the parking is in fact required to be located on the green belt, how do you strike the balance? Are the reasons for utilising the land in the green belt such that they clearly outweigh the harm to openness or other harm?
Well, you need to obviously look at the benefits that BAL have put forward, but in terms of, if first of all, if I was just looking at the policy DM12, I would say that there is clear conflict with the DM12, and in terms of the balance, I would consider the different aspects that BAL have put forward in terms of their benefits to see. But on the very special circumstances, obviously they'd got three different criteria that they put forward, and my view was that they did not represent very special circumstances.
Right, let's move away from Greenbelt and turn on to the benefits of the appeal scheme. First thing I wanted to ask you about relates to the inquiry note that the Council has put in INQ 58. And this relates to the discussions that followed my questioning of Mr. Brass about the extent to which Bristol Airport Limited had responded to the Council's request for information relating to the logic model and how it worked. So they were trying to determine the extent to which it was reliable or not. And in this note it's explained that there were meetings and that the way in which the allocation model works relies upon centrally a figure called a lambda value, which dictates how sensitive passenger demand is to a range of factors such as time, cost, frequencies, etc. The note explains that good practice in WebTag is that the description should be provided as the reasoning behind the choice of lambda parameter value, and where that value is derived from local calibration, the data source is used in the calibration process. It explains that no information has been provided in the evidence regarding the lambda value or how it was determined or how it was calibrated, if indeed it was calibrated, and through the discussions Jacob sought access to that information. York Aviation expressed concerns about providing access to that information on the basis of commercial confidentiality, and in fact no access has been provided to the Council, and the note explains the submissions that the Council is going to make as a result of the fact that it has been unable to scrutinise the logic model in order to determine whether it's robust or not. Can you just explain, please, as a result of that, what weight you consider should be given to the logic model and its output, and indeed any assessment which is based upon its output, in the absence of any ability by anybody to scrutinise that model?
Well, because it can't be scrutinised and the outputs then can't be tested, then it's got to be given limited weight.
And just to explore the consequences of that, you'll remember Mr. Brass's economic impact assessment, many of the points he looked at, particularly relating to displacement and who would travel where and when if permissions refused or granted, depended upon the output of that model. If that model hasn't been the subject of any independent scrutiny whatsoever and is to be given limited weight, what weight do you think the inspectors should give to the economic benefit appraisal that Mr. Brass has presented at this inquiry?
Well, since it relies on the logic model to produce some of the outcomes, then again, limited weight to Mr. Brass's evidence.
Right, thank you. In terms of the other issues in relation to benefits, we heard debate very early on, feels like a lifetime ago, about business passengers, and you'll recall Mr. Ciro's evidence about the need to focus very carefully on what business passengers would do in the scenario if permission is refused compared to the scenario if permission were granted, and he reminded the inquiry about the propensity of business passengers to pay more than leisure passengers, and he produced his two scenarios, one in which there was effectively no increase in business passengers with the granted planning permission because in the no expansion case those business passengers would simply displace leisure passengers, and another where he looked at 50%. In your view, what does that evidence mean for the weight to be afforded to the economic benefits that Mr. Brass identified, even putting the logic issue to one side?
Well, again, if it's in terms of the business passengers, then on Mr. Ciro's evidence, then limited weight would be given to Mr. Brass's evidence, because the business passengers either, as you say, get displaced, or if permission is granted, there wouldn't be any net increase in the business travel.
In terms of additional connectivity, this is the point about whether the connectivity of the UK is and the region is materially benefited by the grant of planning permission. What do you have to say about that?
My recollection of the evidence was that there was discussion about whether additional flights would be put on. One discussion was about the Flybe Frankfurt flight having dropped and now being taken over by Lufthansa, although that's obviously 2010 permission really it comes under. But from the evidence, there was nothing presented that showed there would be additional connectivity.
Thank you. In terms of the evidence that has been provided by Bristol Airport Limited, what evidence have you seen that identifies that any particular additional route would be brought on stream, or that there would be any particular increase in frequency of flights on existing routes?
The only one that I recall being mentioned was the Lufthansa flight to Frankfurt, but that is an existing route. I don't recall there being any new routes being advanced. There was discussion about Jet 2 obviously coming in, but I'm not aware of new routes
So, in the absence of the identification of any particular additional route or any particular increase in frequency on existing routes, what weight do you give to the contention that there would be improved connectivity if planning permission is granted for the proposed expansion?
There's no weight can be given to that.
Let's move on to look at displacement as an issue. This arose in the context of the economic benefits. Again, this is about looking at what happens in the with and without expansion scenarios. You'll recall the discussion about that. And you'll recall Mr. Ciro identifying that I think if permission is refused, some 1.24 million passengers would fly anyway from other airports, and that the remaining passengers represented induced demand. To what extent, even putting aside the logic model, to what extent do you think displacement has an impact in terms of the weight to be given to Mr. Brass's assessment of economic benefit?
Well, initially, Mr. Brass wasn't accepting displacement. Then with Mr. Ciro's evidence, there was the discussion on that. Mr. Brass's evidence, I think, was overstated.
Sorry, Mr. Brass's evidence was understated.
Overstated.
Overstated, right.
So Mr. Ciro obviously looked at that in his evidence.
All right, thank you. The levelling up agenda next, there was some discussion about that. Can you just explain whether, where you've got to in terms of your appraisal of the extent to which granting permission for the expansion at Bristol Airport as proposed in this appeal is consistent or contrary to the levelling up agenda?
There was some discussion as to whether additional flights, additional capacity at Bristol, additional passengers would actually prejudice Cardiff. And I know there is, Cardiff itself is obviously an area that's more of a priority, although I recognise that Mr. Humphreys did point out about the Vale of Glamorgan, but Cardiff itself would obviously be the priority one. So it could be argued that you're prioritising an area that does not need to level up as much as another area which could suffer from the expansion here.
Right, thank you. Carbon values next, the implications of those. I think the inquiry will have seen INQ 75, and that is the note placed before the inquiry by Mr. Ciro in terms that looks at the implications of the new policy paper from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And we don't need to go into the detail of this, but we can note the conclusion that he reaches by reference to the appraisal that's been conducted by Mr. Brass. Just explain, please, what the change in carbon values means for the consideration of the benefits, the economic benefits of the scheme.
I would need to find it. So Mr. Siru, in his notes, showed that there'd been revisions
Yes,
to,
paragraph 16, I think,
yeah,
is what
to
you're
the
looking at.
benefits. So from the expansion originally was 1,565 million at the time of the original application. Then he says it decreased at the beginning of the inquiry to 820 million. And now, on the basis of this latest valuation, it's 502 million. So he says the benefits have declined by 2/3 since the original planning application was submitted. He also says in the next paragraph, paragraph 17, that it doesn't take into account any of the uncertainties relating to carbon emissions. And there he raises the difference of a fleet mix, whereas if you do have an older fleet mix, you could need to look at greater GHG emissions. So the NPV could be reduced still further, was his conclusion there. And I think in paragraph 25, he looks at passenger forecasts, but he does conclude at the end of that. So he does question whether it would add price. Airlines could pass the price on to passengers. He indicates that could be as £10.45p per trip in paragraph 29. But he does conclude at the end to say he doesn't think it's unlikely that if traded price of carbon was to increase to the new non-traded values, that there would be a material impact on total passenger demand at Bristol Airport, although there may be a change in distribution of destinations served. Hence, in our view, he says, there is no reason to revise passenger forecasts. So his main thing in terms of the implications of the BEIS paper was that the benefits have declined by 2/3 compared to what was originally stated when the planning application was first submitted.
Okay, thank you. Now, another benefit identified by Bristol Airport Limited in its case is the potential to claw back passengers who, if planning permission were refused, would travel further afield to fly. In particular, it is contended, by reference to the appraisal based upon the logic model, that if planning permission were refused, lots of the passengers who would otherwise fly from Bristol would fly from Gatwick or Heathrow. Now, I think Mr. Zero identified it was some 70% of the passengers who would fly if planning permission were refused from Gatwick or Heathrow. To what extent do you consider the inspector should give weight to that argument?
Well, because you haven't been able to scrutinise the logic model, again, only limited weight can be given to that. He wasn't able to determine why 70% would. So sorry, the answer is limited weight.
Thank you. All right. In terms then of ecology, I think there is a claimed benefit there. What do you say to that?
There's a claimed benefit, but I understood that was a habitats mitigation measure. So I don't know that that's a benefit. That's mitigation.
And similarly, in respect to surface access, is there a net benefit?
Well, it doesn't achieve what it should. It's not ambitious. And it would be required in accordance with policy to secure surface access improvements to incur public transport mode shift, ambitious targets. It's not a benefit, it's not achieving those, but it should be.
All right, thank you. Now, last part, I think we might finish in time. The overall balance, if we come back to CS23, indeed, and answer this context in this question in the context of policy DMP 50 as well. Looking at the matters in the round, what conclusion do you reach?
Well, it's in CS23 you're required required to demonstrate satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure. And it doesn't achieve that. On DM50, development within the green belt is permitted at Bristol Airport, provided that some of the criteria, environmental impacts, such as emissions, are minimised, and there is no unacceptable noise impact, and appropriate provision of surface access.
So, in terms of policy CS23 and DM50, do we have a breach or compliance, or what?
It doesn't comply with those two policies.
And in terms of the development plan as a whole, in the light of the policies we've been through, to what extent is there accord with the development plan as a whole?
It doesn't accord with the development plan as a whole. I would just refer the inspectors to my proof of evidence does go through the various policies, especially if you look at the individual sections on noise, air quality. It does highlight the policies and what I think of those, and the compliance.
Okay, so turning then to other material considerations, national aviation policy, to what extent does is that a factor which weighs in favour of grant or in favour of refusal?
Earlier we looked at that and said that it was contrary to.
All right.
That the requirement, the growth is not unconditional, and it therefore needs to meet the conditions that are set out.
In terms of the MPPF, is that a matter that weighs in favour or against the grant?
It weighs against.
And in terms of the benefits, we're in a situation where you've identified breach of the development plan as a whole, aviation policy nationally weighing against, the MPPF weighing against. To what extent do the benefits that have been identified outweigh those considerations?
Well, there are some benefits, but they've been overstated and they don't outweigh the conflict.
And so when we carry out the balancing required by the approach required by section 38.6 and indeed by paragraph 11 of the MPPF, what conclusion do you come to?
I conclude that it should be refused planning permission. And sorry, just to say that the paragraphs 249 to 254 of my proof of evidence put that.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Gola. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Young's got a question for you.
Just a quick question, just picking you up on something you said there, jumped out a little bit at me. You made a comment just then to the effect of required to deliver surface access improvements, and then you went on to say it doesn't deliver surface access improvements.
Sorry, I was just reading CS23 said, including demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I don't think I specifically said.
Well, perhaps you didn't. Perhaps I misheard you. I thought you said surface access improvement and it didn't deliver any. But if that's clarified it for me anyway.
I would have to listen on YouTube again to see if I said that.
Thank you. Yeah. Did I thought he said that, but no, I think you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine. Thank you.
Shall we have a very short comfort break? I'm conscious we've got the 4 o'clock appointment for Mr. Renshaw. I know we've not long come back from lunch, but...
Well, yeah, I was hoping we could all go and gather around a radiator or something.
We do have an update on that, actually. The heating, I think, is...
For
has
people
been
watching on YouTube, they won't quite understand quite how cold it is in this room.
Yes, the thermostat should hopefully have been overridden, so we may warm up. So if we...
I just love the idea that there are lots of people watching this on YouTube. Try and doubt seriously, but anyway. Before we break, can I just mention that just before we started, the council has provided its comments on the 106 and the UU to BAL, and we hope that either the council or BAL will be providing you with an updated position before the end of the day.
Excellent, thank you. That was on our list to pick up before we finish today. So, okay, if we have just a 10-minute, 15-minute break, we'll come back at 5 to 3, and then we'll proceed with cross-examination. Thank you. Okay, yeah, welcome back. Mr. Humphreys, it's cross-examination. You've got 3 hours, I think, in the timetable. Is it likely to be 3 hours?
Yes?
Yes, okay. Just checking.
I mean, there's always a little bit of variability, and things go faster and things go slower, and also there's quite a lot of new stuff in the evidence in chief. I make no criticism of that, but you just kind of have to weigh these things up. But I understand the imperative of being speedy, so I'll do my best.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And we have got Mr. Renshaw at 4 o'clock
We
as
have
well, but we'll break it at a point that you're satisfied, sort of,
Sure.
a natural stop. Okay.
Thank you. Because I'll be slightly focusing on my notes and what Mr. Gertler is saying, you may have to slightly prompt me. I apologise if I won't precisely know at 4 o'clock when it is 4 o'clock. Hello again, Mr. Gertler.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Gertler, before talking about some of the policy issues, which are obviously important, I just want to go step back a bit and look a little bit at how we got here, recognising obviously that you were instructed in August 2020. We have before us the original officer's report at CD 4.11, and that runs to some 235 pages, of which about 146 are analysis of the issues, the environmental and other information, and at what they called issue 24, there was a summary and planning balance that set out the officer's views in some detail, isn't there? And that's perhaps a fair short summary of that report.
Yes.
And the officers came to a conclusion. They advised members on their views on the likely significant effects and compliance with policy.
They did.
And their conclusions, the local officers here, was that the development complies with all local plan policies and indeed national policies in the MPPF. That's fair, isn't it?
I think that's fair, yes.
And they recommended approval, but members refused, and they suggested at that stage some draft reasons for refusal. My understanding is you had no involvement at that time, so no direct knowledge of why members rejected the officer's advice and so on. That's just not within your knowledge.
No, I had no involvement.
No. That very fair. And ditto, exactly the same point with the what I'll just call the PCAA Council's advice. We've gone through that in the past. I don't need to go through it in detail. We have the document at CD 19.11, but you had no involvement at the time or no direct knowledge of that.
No direct knowledge of that.
Okay. There was then a further committee meeting on the 18th of March, and we have the report for that as CD 4.13, and that again is a very long report. Part of it is in effect the earlier report, but there's a section at the front which gives specific advice to officers, to members following the first meeting, and I would like us just to explore that a little bit by way of background to what became the reasons for refusal. So could you turn up CD 4.13. Do you have it?
No, not yet, sorry.
Just tell me when you've got it. There's no hurry.
Sorry, did you say 13, yes?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, yeah.
4.13.
Yeah. It's thinking. Okay, I've got that.
Yep. And on page 2, towards the bottom, PDF page 2, there's the summary of the report. And it tells us that they considered the application originally on the 10th of February. As the resolution was contrary to the officer's recommendation, the application was held over to a future meeting to enable the issues raised to be considered before the committee confirms its decision. It attaches the original report, and it says the officer's recommendation is unchanged, but comments are provided on the reasons for refusal. And it's that I just want to briefly touch on, and so we turn on to the next page. And on the next page, we have the original reasons for refusal that members had identified. So these are not the same as the final reasons for refusal. But I just want to look at a few examples to see the ways in which certain things evolved. So the original reason for refusal 2, for example, said that the proposed development does not make a sustainable contribution to economic objectives due to the scale of outbound leisure and with low-skilled jobs at the airport giving way to automation. It's uncertain that expansion will deliver additional and sustainable jobs. And then the claimed economic benefits arising from the proposal would therefore not outweigh environmental harm. Now, in the final reasons for refusal, that disappears, doesn't it? They no longer draw attention to the issue of outbound leisure and low-skilled jobs. That formed no part of the final reason for refusal, did it?
No. Sorry, no.
But it still seems to be part of the case that's been presented.
The case that's being presented has looked at the benefits and disbenefits associated with it.
Yeah, of course. I do understand that.
Yeah.
But members specifically, when in the cold light of day they considered this, members themselves did not adopt that particular line of argument, outbound tourism and low-skilled jobs.
No, they didn't.
No. If we look at the original reason for refusal 3, and not that it matters, but coincidentally the policy referred to in that reason for refusal, CS20, was subsequently changed in the final reason for refusal to CS23. Okay. Reason for refusal 3, this is the one about serious adverse effects on health and well-being of residents. But the officer's report had made it clear, hadn't it, that this was of limited relevance. Turn on to page 5 of the report, which is the officers commenting on the members' draft reasons for refusal. Policy CS26 is referred to as the basis for the reason for refusal. The policy seeks to promote healthier lifestyles and reduce health inequalities through a variety of measures. Policy recognizes quality of environment people live in greatly influences physical and mental health. The content and objective of the policy is concerned primarily with improving healthcare services, promoting healthier lifestyles and reducing inequality. Whilst it does require that health impact assessments are submitted for all large-scale developments, which was done, the policy is otherwise of limited relevance. So the officers gave very, very specific advice, didn't they, that this policy, whilst requiring HRIA, is just of very limited relevance.
That's what's written there, but obviously in the evidence I've given, there is no point just conducting an HIA and not following through when you look at the sustainable communities strategy, the core strategy itself and its vision and its principal aims, and then apply CS26. You wouldn't just conduct an HIA and not act upon it, which the requirement is improve healthier lifestyles and aim to reduce health inequalities.
Well, obviously the inspectors will be able to read the words of the policy, but the inspectors ought to know, don't they, that the officers responsible for the application of local policy here, they themselves don't think it's relevant, or of limited relevance, sorry.
Yeah, in that report, they have referred to the policy seeking to promote healthier lifestyles. They have referred to it in terms of requiring the HIA. And sorry, my computer's just turned off. And as you say, the final sentence in that first paragraph is the officers, the policy is otherwise of limited relevance. But so that is what they advised committee on the 18th of March. But in the evidence we've been presenting, you can see why we've said that given that the emphasis in the core strategy on improving health and well-being, it is relevant, and just conducting an HIA for the sake of a tick box exercise would be inappropriate.
Okay, well, I mean, we obviously have a difference between us on the proper interpretation of policy, but we can see what the officers were advising their members on this. There was a reason for refusal 5, originally on wildlife habitats, and members did ultimately take advice and remove that one. And in relation to the final reason for refusal, it's numbered here 7. So if you look at the bottom of page 6, you'll see the officers' advice to members on what was the original reason 7.
Sorry, on which page? Page 6?
Bottom of page 6, you'll see a heading reason 7. This is the officers advising members about the members' sort of draft reasons. And if you turn to the middle of the next page, page 7, the officers advise them very clearly as follows. It should be noted, however, that the evidence in the transport assessment, which has been examined and challenged in depth by the Council as Highway Authority in conjunction with its independent consultants, does not support a conclusion that a safe or suitable access cannot be achieved, nor does it support a conclusion that an increase in traffic volumes, congestion, parking on the local roads would have a severe impact. As set out in the February committee report, a range of measures are proposed to mitigate the impact. So again, very clear advice, isn't there, from officers that they have thoroughly tested the transport assessment and they just do not support the reasons for refusal. They haven't changed their recommendation, have they?
They haven't changed their recommendation, but obviously there has been a lot of discussion leading up to the public inquiry, at the public inquiry, going through the issues, and you've heard Mr. Collins' evidence as well.
Yes. And if we turn on to the bottom of page 8, officers just making it absolutely crystal clear for members what they were doing. Financial implications. Planning appeal would require the council to incur expenditure in relation to engaging a barrister and expert witnesses. The council is also at risk of an award of costs against it in any future appeal proceedings if it cannot justify its decision on the basis of development plan policy or other material considerations. National planning guidance sets out the examples of what may lead to an award of costs against planning authorities. These include failure to produce evidence to substantiate each reason for refusal on appeal, vague, generalized or inaccurate assertions about a proposal's impact which are unsupported by objective analysis. Pretty clear advice, I think you would agree.
It is clear advice, but we've just spent how many months going through the evidence?
Yes.
And it's not vague, generalised,
No.
inaccurate
But
assertions.
at no point have we ever heard from a member or an officer or a consultant who was in the room at the time to tell us why it was that members rejected the very clear advice from officers on the environmental effects and how they came to a reasoned conclusion. Do you remember in opening, I drew attention to the legal requirements on a council in that regard. That's why every witness I have asked, were you there, were you involved? Because I would have asked them about it. I asked you. There's no evidence on that, is there?
There's no evidence of any of us being involved in the decision. That's correct.
Of anyone actually being able to explain the basis on which members rejected the technical advice on environmental impact assessment and formed a, quote, reasoned conclusion on that in integrating that, again, quote,
yeah,
from the regulations into a decision. There's never been any evidence on that.
There has been no one here who was involved in that process or could give you advice on that. But you have heard evidence from everybody on the council side who has had to follow their professional body's requirements.
Of
and
course.
You've had the environmental statement, the environmental statement addenda, and the various proofs of evidence all reviewed by other expert witnesses. And the decision, the case I think that the council has put is a very strong one.
Now, let's come to the reasons for refusal themselves, the actual reasons for refusal, and that's CD 416.
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention, sorry.
No, it's all right. CD 4.16. And when we look at the reasons for refusal, and we obviously need to bear in mind, as was discussed earlier in the inquiry, these have to be precisely drafted. When we look at them, nowhere did members suggest that the information that they had been provided with was inadequate, or that as a council, the council had not had access to information, models, anything else that it requested. You sometimes get reasons for refusal that are formulated, no adequate evidence was presented to demonstrate that. There's none of that in here, is there?
In the reasons for refusal?
No. None.
No. So don't
If
shake
you
it.
look at the reasons for refusal, let's take the first one as an example. third line, the further expansion beyond 10 mppa now proposed would, positive case, would generate additional noise, traffic, and off-airport car parking, resulting in adverse environmental impacts. Go on to the top of the next page, which would have an adverse impact on an inadequate surface access infrastructure. Claimed economic benefits would not outweigh. Number 2, noise, an impact on air quality would have a significant impact. If you go through all of the reasons for refusal, every single one that the members adopted sets out a positive case that the council is going to present.
Is that a question?
Yes.
It does say would in those, yes.
And of course, we know that for any authority, it's for that authority to, again, quote, substantiate its reasons for refusal. But the case that it has to substantiate in this case is a positive case that these impacts would occur, isn't it?
Yes, the case is that
They would occur.
there would be adverse impacts, yes.
There's no question of the council in some way auditing or testing the case or anything like that. There's no reason for refusal based on the council needing to test. You're not auditors in this process, are you? You're presenting a case.
I'm presenting a case, yes.
Yes. And, you know, it's trite law going back to when I was called in 1982 that there's no burden of proof in planning inquiries, is there?
There isn't.
Go back to the High Court decision in Pye, Oxford.
Oh.
My former head of chambers was
Okay.
the judge. There's no burden of proof on an applicant in these things, no legal burden of proof, is there?
I don't believe so.
No. What we do know is that members cannot have based their decision on the current NSC evidence, can they? Because none of the witnesses were advising at that time. Plus, every witness, or nearly every witness, Mr. Taylor has asked all the things that happened since. The council's case is a new case, isn't it?
My understanding is that members were briefed frequently and raised questions leading up to the process, leading up to the decision.
Exactly so. But the evidence now, the case now, is a new case. We've never been told why members rejected the technical advice.
I can't give you an answer. I have watched the committee process on the video. I can't give you an answer as to why, but the 5 reasons for refusal are there, and the 5 reasons for refusal have been addressed. And
yes, and present a positive case. You as a council will substantiate a case that there will be an impact on this, or there will be a significant effect on that, something else, as we agreed.
I'm not sure if I agreed that. Sorry, say that.
The council's case, as we agreed, in each case, in each
Is
reason
would.
for refusal, either says would do something, that the development would do something, or I think in one case, I think in 5, public transport provision is inadequate. Not you haven't demonstrated it's adequate, but it is inadequate.
Yeah,
And that's the case as I understand
but again, if you go back to 4 then, sorry, 4 obviously hasn't got anything like that in it. 4 is clearly the one that I've obviously been giving evidence on, is the greenbelt issue with no very special circumstances. It is, obviously, if you look at MPPF, it is harm to the greenbelt, it is inappropriate development in the greenbelt. So your supposition or whatever proposition that you put to me isn't correct for every single reason for refusal.
Let's put that one to the side then, because I did
But that's
cross-examine you on that one.
Yeah, but that's
last
2
time.
you've put to a side because you've just said number 5 as well.
No, number 5 is, I mean, it doesn't say would, but it says is inadequate. It's another positive case. You're not saying we haven't demonstrated that it's adequate. I don't want to labour this for too long. I mean, the inspectors can see the point, but that's why, isn't it, because it is in fact a new case, not substantiating the reasons for refusal, why the council's evidence now so constantly goes beyond the reasons for refusal. Because it's just a new case. It's not based on what the members thought. So, for example, highways, design of the A38, there's nothing in the reason for refusal about that, is there?
No, but I don't think we don't go beyond it. Mr. Collins, in looking at it, has a professional duty to advise the inspectors from his engineering background as a transport person on issues like safety. And yes, it's not in the reason for refusal. But the same with exactly the same point on the A38 encroachment into the greenbelt, the fillets and the taxiway extension. I have a duty to actually respond and give my professional opinion on that.
Mr. Gertler, with respect, you're not some sort of amicus curiae here, you know, as a free-ranging spirit able to just help the inspectors. You're supposed to be representing the council's case and its reasons for refusal. And that's why, in your first evidence on the Greenbelt, I asked you very specifically, do you remember, when I said you'd clearly gone beyond the reason for refusal, had the council seen this before it was published? And what did you tell me?
And I confirmed that was the case.
They had. In other words, it's not you, it's the council has endorsed something that goes beyond its case.
But I don't believe that's the case, because obviously when you took Mr. Melling this morning to the footnote, I'm quite clear that on that issue, as I was in cross-examination, that I am not going beyond the council's position. I am giving my opinion. I deal with a lot of permitted development works at airports. I am giving my opinion. I frequently work for, I mean, as you saw in my qualifications or evidence experience, I do work for airport operators. I am quite happy to look at their statutory powers, what they can do under permitted development rights, but I've also looked at it from a point of view of, I think the one I quoted one was Red Hill, and whether I think that is inappropriate development or not. But I made it very clear, I deliberately had that footnote in, saying my decision has not been based on that, but I'm giving my opinion.
Yes, suggest to you it's inevitable with all of those things, the A38 stuff, economics, outbound tourism, your greenbelt points, air quality, ultrafine particles, not in the reason for refusal. All of those things, once put in, an appellant of course has to respond to them, doesn't it?
Sorry, what was that? I didn't hear that last
Don't worry
bit.
at all.
Once put in...
As soon as those things are put in, an appellant has to respond.
Yes, an appellant would have to respond.
Let's move on.
But sorry, can I just one thing again from Mr. Mellings this morning? I mean, he I think it was this morning, he insinuated that I'd spent a lot of time on the A38 and on the fillets, the taxiway improvements. There's only 3 or 4 paragraphs on each one. It really isn't, and some of it's just setting the background. So I personally disagree with that. Policy,
and I was going to look at some national policy issues and then some local policy issues. And just to be clear, because, as with Mr. Taylor, as each of the witnesses has come along in each of the topics, I've asked them questions about their own area of expertise within the context of policy. I'm not going to rehearse with you what each of those witnesses said. What I'm going to try and do is I can't promise to be absolutely good on this, but I'm going to try to just focus on the policy framework and understanding the way that works, and the inspectors will have their own notes, their own judgment, their own feel about the evidence and how that fits in. So I will try and do that with you. And I wanted to start on national policy just by looking at things slightly thematically.
Okay.
So I'm going to come to a number of themes and see if we can just agree a broad position on the policy framework within which the inspectors operate. So first thing, the objective of achieving economic growth. So that's the theme. And I'm going to take you to that paragraph at the beginning of the APF, so CD 6.1, that Mr. Taylor took you to today. So that's page 9.
Sorry, my computer.
And it's paragraph 5.
It's just said it's out of memory. Sorry, can you say again which?
Yes, of course. It's page 9, paragraph 5. And I'm going to come back to things like balance of benefits and impacts, but I'm just on growth at the moment. And it makes it pretty clear there, doesn't it, at the beginning of paragraph 5, that the government's primary objective is to achieve long-term economic growth. And that's an important policy, isn't it, that permeates many of the policy documents that we've looked at during the course of the inquiry, particularly actually in some of the socio-economic stuff.
It does say that.
Well, I know it does say that. It's an important
It is an important
theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if we, as I say, I'm not going to take you through lots and lots of quotes in this document. That will be pointless. If we could look at just a couple more documents, though, just very briefly. So, Build Back Better, which we have a CD 11.10. There we need to turn to page 11. And again, we will have touched on this earlier in the inquiry. That's why I'm trying to take this fairly light touch. The emboldened text on page 11 in the bottom right-hand corner of the page. Our plan is to build back better. Our plan to build back better takes a transformational approach, tackling long-term problems to deliver growth that creates high-quality jobs across the UK and makes the most of the strengths of the union. We must retain our guiding focus on achieving people's priorities, levelling up the whole of the UK, supporting our transition to net zero, and supporting our vision for a global Britain. And again, we can see, can't we, as a backdrop to the entire policy context for this inquiry, that growth, creation of high-quality jobs, levelling up, transformation to net zero, supporting the vision of a global Britain, those are important themes, aren't they, of national policy? Yeah,
can you again just remind me what page?
I'm so sorry.
No,
Mr.
I've got it again. Page 11.
It's page 11.
I mean,
Do you want me to
no,
go back?
I heard you say it. I mean, there are obviously, levelling up is mentioned in that. Obviously, our department now has that name in its title. It is one aspect that's mentioned in there.
Yes, I wasn't focusing just on that, but to give the inspectors a sort of, see if we can agree, and I hope we can, that these themes are important ones as the backdrop to the consideration of this application.
Yes, obviously there's been quite a lot of discussion on the economic side of the development.
Yes, and if we want to understand a little bit about how in planning terms these economic themes should be regarded, we can see that if we turn to the MPPF. So turn to the MPPF, which is CD 5.8.1.
Yep.
And turn in that to page 23, please.
Sorry, it's just...
Page 81 sorry, paragraph 81 on page 23. So planning policies and decisions should help create the conditions.
Sorry, Mr. Humphreys.
I'm so sorry.
No, my computer says its memory is struggling now. I don't close documents. On page 23, paragraph 81.
Please. Do you have this in CD 5.8.1?
Yeah. Under the building a strong economy.
Yeah. Planning policies and decisions should help create the conditions in which businesses can invest, expand and adapt. Significant weight should be placed on the need to support economic growth and productivity, taking into account both local business needs and the wider opportunities for development. So it's clear that not only is economic growth, levelling up, these things important themes nationally for government, but also within a planning context, significant weight should be placed on them.
Yes, within a planning context. So, and again, you've obviously had a lot of evidence given on the economic benefits of the scheme or not. And if you were to refer back to paragraph 8 of the MPPF, you've got the 3 strands of sustainable development. So you have got your economic,
yes,
and
is important. Social
and
social
environmental.
within people's ability to go on holidays and enjoy life, do things like that,
and healthy communities.
And health in communities and environment. Yes.
Yeah. I agree. It does say significant weight, but then you obviously look at the assessment, and no doubt we will get down to that later.
Clearly, government sees all of those themes, so economic growth, high quality jobs, levelling up, transition to net zero, global Britain, as being objectives. It doesn't see a contradiction between them, does it? It doesn't see a contradiction between growth on the one hand and net zero on the other.
It talks about a balance, though.
Oh, of course there's a balance, but it doesn't see a contradiction.
But there could be a contradiction.
Well, we can look at that on the evidence, but at a policy level, and go back to Build Back Better if you like, clearly government's objective is to achieve all of those aims. Can we agree that?
It obviously tries to.
The next theme I just wanted to touch on with you is the importance of international connectivity to the UK economy. So we've talked about the economy in general. We want to see now how, as a matter of general policy, government places international connectivity. And so if you could go back to the APF, and this time turn on to PDF page 10 and paragraph 9. In fact, I think it's the bottom actually of PDF page 9 and the top of 10. So paragraph 9 in the APF.
Yep.
And again, emboldened, so drawing attention to itself, one of our main objectives is to ensure that the UK's air links continue to make it one of the best connected countries in the world. This includes increasing our links to emerging markets so that the UK can compete successfully for economic growth. And it goes on to talk about hub capability, point to point, and refers at the end to government's commitment to economic growth. So clearly, again, as a matter of national policy, international connectivity, good air links, is regarded as being one of the main objectives. It's a high priority, isn't it?
Yes, it does say one of our main objectives. Obviously, the government has probably said the same in terms of, because of our move away from the EU, want to be an outward-facing nation. But again, in the evidence that you've had presented to the inquiry, Bristol Airport, my understanding, does not provide any links to emerging markets, and it doesn't serve as a hub airport.
No, that's...
But that's just, you know, I don't want to be seen to be agreeing with every sentence that you've said in that. I accept that the government does say one of our main objectives is to ensure UK air links continue to make one of the best connected.
And indeed, the whole of section 1 of this document, we've been looking at the executive summary, but if you turn on to PDF page 16, the whole of section 1 is about supporting growth and the benefits of aviation. Indeed, if you turn on to PDF page 25, again, I'm not going to take you to lots and lots of quotes, but from 25 onwards for pages, it talks about the importance of connectivity. It's clearly a hugely important theme to UK government, isn't it?
It is, and you then also have the whole of section 2 or chapter 2 talking about climate change, and the whole of chapter 3 talking about noise and other local environmental impacts.
We will, of course, come to those. That's why I explained I was going to go through themes. I'm just on the theme of connectivity at the moment. And you can see, for example, as part of that, the economic benefits, government specifically tackles this point that is sometimes made about outbound tourism. So paragraph 1.16, which is on PDF page 19, it gives us the policy position on this. Consultation response is divided on economic impacts of outbound tourism. Some considered there was a tourism deficit. Others highlighted outbound tourism supports UK-based jobs. Respondents confirmed that the tourism deficit is a complex one and that the evidence available to us does not show that a decrease in the number of UK residents flying abroad for their holidays would have an overall benefit for the UK. Goes on and gives some figures. The government believes that the chance to fly abroad also offers quality of life benefits, including educational and skills development. So although there's been debate about this, actually the policy position on it is pretty clear, isn't it? It's not UK government policy to stop people flying abroad in order to try to improve our balance of payments.
No, the government obviously thinks that people should be able to travel and make that choice.
And that there are quality of life benefits, somewhat intangible.
For some people, there will be quality of life benefits of travel. Holidays, yes. There's equally...
Well, I imagine, you know, prior to your private life, but I imagine you may have gone on holiday abroad, and people do, and they do it because they enjoy it.
I would be what they mistakenly call a staycation, and I predominantly, in the last 20 years, have had holidays in England. I refuse to accept that as a staycation. It's a holiday in England, or Wales, or Scotland. But
well, good.
Unfortunately, my flying, although I may represent airports, and I have worked abroad for NGOs, my flying and my carbon footprint in the last 20 years is very low.
It wasn't a criticism of you. I was just saying people do fly
People do fly
abroad because they enjoy it, because it's a benefit.
I personally, I love the experience of a plane taking off.
Thank you.
And I haven't done that for many years.
Clearly for the UK, aviation links, air links are important because, as I pointed out before, I almost sort of surprised myself with the fact that we only have one land link to the rest of the world, the Channel Tunnel. And therefore, obviously, aviation is going to be important to the UK.
Yes, aviation will be.
Because, you know, few people nowadays go on holiday by ship, do they? Some do, not many.
Some do. I wouldn't be able to tell you the figures. But.
And that puts us actually in a rather different position from most large continental countries. Aviation is important for our connectivity in order to be global, isn't it?
Yes, it is important.
Let's just talk about then, third theme, regional airports and MBU. And I want to put aside for the moment, at first, weight. We will come to weight. But I just want to understand what the policy is, whatever weight we attach to it. Again, in the APF, perhaps we can just sample one or two places where this is dealt with. So PDF page 10. And paragraph 10. So in the short to medium term, a key priority, sorry. No, sorry, we're in the APF. 6.1. I'm sorry.
He did, but...
I may well have, and I'm sorry if I did.
APF still.
I'll start with the APF.
Page 10.
Page 10.
And did you say paragraph 10 as well?
Paragraph 10 as well. Sorry for causing confusion.
You didn't say you were taking us to MBU. You did say you wanted to explore MBU and what was said in the APF.
Thank you.
So.
In the short to medium term, the key priority is to work with the aviation sector and other stakeholders to make better use of existing runway capacity at all UK airports. Let's look at a second quote and then let's just sort of explore it. Let's look at page 20. And paragraph 1.23.
Sorry, I jumped too far.
That's all right. Page 20, paragraph 1.23.
Yep.
Do you have it?
Yes.
Airports in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales and outside the south east of England have an important role in helping to accommodate wider forecast growth in demand for aviation in the UK, which could help take some pressure off London's main airports. I think the next paragraph, which is a couple of pages on PDF, page 22, paragraph 1.24, again has the quote you were taken to before, I think.
Yep.
The last sentence, we therefore consider proposals for expansion of these airports should be judged on individual merits, taking account of relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts, and that's following on from the beginning of the paragraph. Government wants to see the best use of existing airport capacity, supporting growth and so on. So put aside weight for the moment. It's pretty clear, isn't it, just looking at the words, that government does have a policy that airports should make better use or make best use of their runways.
Yes, it's putting aside the
Well, I genuinely, we will come back to the question of what weight and climate change and those things, but just understanding the, what the policy is, what the policy has always been.
even since 2004, in the Air Transport White Paper, since 2004, the Air Transport White Paper, there has been reference to making better or best use of existing capacity.
Yes, that's. Thank you, and of course I acknowledge that. I just wanted to get our lines clear before we get into the controversial bits about weight and everything else, that there is actually a policy that airports should make best use or better use of their existing infrastructure, their existing runways.
Those words are definitely there in the aviation policy framework. And
I know the words are there.
So,
I may be difficult to say it, but can we just agree that that is a policy?
it's a policy in the APF. It is written about making best use or better use.
Okay. And that policy theme, again, subject to obviously talking about weight and subject obviously to talk about balancing other factors, continued, didn't it, in the document that we call MBU, CD 6.4. Perhaps you could look at that one too. And turn to PDF page 4, and the very first paragraph.
Sorry, Mr. Humphries. When we have a break, I'm going to have to restart my computer because it is out of memory, so it's struggling to look at documents.
I sometimes suffer the same problem, to be absolutely honest. Do you want to stop there?
Well, Mr. Renshaw's actually here, so would that be a good place for you to stop, given
It's
the
not the
computer
perfect place,
issue?
but it's a perfectly acceptable place.
Carry on. I'll get it.
Let's. I tell you what. Let's stop.
Yeah.
There. Let's get this fixed
Okay,
for
thank you.
Mr. Gertler.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just close down and start again. Sorry.
Right, Mr. Melling, part 2. 3, is it? I'm sorry, I've lost count. I wonder if you could regain your previous seat. Mr. Renshaw, I see that you're with us on Teams. If you could perhaps join us on. Here we go.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Haven't got a camera on you at the moment, Mr. Renshaw. Don't know if that's deliberate or.
My camera's on, as far as I'm aware.
Ah. not coming through on... okay, I'm told that we're on it. And I say we, I've got nothing to do with it at all. There you are, Mr. Renshaw. Hello. We're just getting Mr. Melling back onto the witness stand, because obviously we're midway through another witness at the moment. So just a bit of a pause. Whilst we do pause, I appreciate, I think, that you've not had the opportunity of hearing the other cross-examinations of Mr. Melling, but he has been cross-examined, obviously, by other parties and indeed re-examined on that evidence. So after you've asked your questions, there may be some brief re-examination by Mr. Humphreys, or perhaps not, we'll see. The only thing that I would mention, and I've mentioned this, I think, to pretty well everybody who's been cross-examining, is this is obviously now dealing with greenbelt matters. We do appreciate the case that you're making on behalf of BALPA, but we do need to focus on the greenbelt issues. I've been saying that to everybody, and some have managed to do that better than others, let's say. But it is a difficult area because there's a lot of overlap. Mr. Melling, are you ready?
I'll just, yep, microphone's on.
Okay, Mr. Renshaw, Mr. Melling is available for your questions.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Melling.
Good afternoon.
And I hope you're a little bit warmer. I was hearing earlier it was a bit chilly in the town hall.
I can confirm it's still a little bit chilly. I think I've lived in the south for too long. I can't take the cold anymore.
Right, well, as you will have read, BALPA say that the airport has failed to consider the relocation of staff car parking as a reasonable alternative to the extent of development proposed in the Greenbelt. Now, in your argument for very special circumstances for the expansion of Greenbelt parking, you say in your proof of evidence, page 89, paragraph 5.4.3, Are you with me?
Yes, I'm at 5.4.3, yes.
So in that paragraph, you say that your parking solution provides the opportunity to bring forward parking on land contiguous to Bristol Airport's operational boundary to meet the residual requirements for car parking and the benefits this delivers in terms of low-cost parking provision and making efficient use of land. Now, in terms of efficient use of land, we have staff car parking on part of the Silver Zone, and as we know, staff cars cannot be block parked, unlike passenger cars. You dismiss this point at your proof of evidence on page 115, I think it is, paragraph 541, where you say...
Sorry, just bear with me a second, just while I... did you say which paragraph are you
Page 115.
115. Is that of the PDF or is that of the actual document?
That is PDF, yes.
And sorry, what was the paragraph number? So I'm working from a hard copy, I'm afraid.
5.41. That's the last paragraph on the page.
5.41. Okay, I'm there.
Yep. Well, here you say that you think it does. That your strategy, BALPA's proposal does not reflect the findings of the PDSU. Now, because the PDSU and your proof of evidence stress the early need for low-cost parking provision, and recent planning history shows that demand for... you say it doesn't reflect the findings of the PDSU. I say it does, because the PDSU and your proof of evidence stress the early need for low-cost parking provision. And recent planning history shows that the demand for premium parking in multi-storey car parks lags behind the need for low-cost parking. So how do you say that Balfour's proposal doesn't reflect the findings of the PDSU?
Well, first of all, I think it's just important. I'm sure the inspectors are aware that we just take a quick step back here, just to confirm that where the staff car parking is currently located to the south of the airport, that formed part of the consent for the permission the airport has to grow to 10 million passengers per annum. So the staff car parking was moved as part of that consent and consistent with that consent. So that's just the first point that I'm sure inspectors are aware of that, but just to raise again. And then secondly, I think my point here is quite a simple one, that the parking demand study update makes clear that there's a need to deliver 4,200 spaces. If one was to move the staff car parking to the north, I think you say that would create 1,000 spaces. Is that correct? I think that's what you say.
Well, the staff car park has just more than 1,000 car parking spaces, but of course, if you replace that with passenger parking, you would then be able to block park it, and also you wouldn't need the staff waiting building and all the turning facilities for their own transport there. We say there must be capable of at least 1,400 spaces block parked there.
But if you were to move those 1,000 spaces to the north of the airport site, that would act to displace premium spaces to the north of the airport site. And there is also a need to meet the demand for those premium spaces. So
yes.
I don't think I think what I'm saying here in paragraph 5.5.41 of my proof is I'm not fully following the logic of the argument, because we're moving spaces from one part of the site to the other, but we also need to be conscious of the different types of demand, and that would displace premium spaces from the north of the airport site, which are also needed as part of the overall requirement to provide 4,200 spaces.
I note what you say, but you say in your proof of evidence, and I need to check where that is. Just 1 minute. Yes, if you go to page 110.
Sorry, I apologize, because I'm working off a hard copy. I'll have to ask, what's the actual number?
Yes, it is 110,
110.
PDF and in a hard copy.
Oh, brilliant. I love it when that happens.
But you say here at 5... sorry, I think it's 5.421, so that's probably not page 110. Beg your pardon, I may have misled you. Sorry, 5.521. I beg your pardon. That's where the discrepancy comes. 5.521 is in the middle of page 110. And you say you're talking about the demand for premium parking. Well, you say that the capacity in relation to multi-storey car park, beg your... I'm sorry, but at some point you say in your proof of evidence that there's been a careful assessment of the requirements for premium parking. Now, I've not seen this careful analysis. The only reference to that analysis of the demand for premium car parking, as far as I can see, is in the PDSU at paragraph 727. And that refers solely to a high-level analysis that indicates that a low-cost parking option is likely to better meet customer needs. So I'd like you to tell me where this careful demand for high-cost parking comes from, please.
I've taken into account the findings of the parking demand study update, which, yes, says there is a more pressing need for low-cost parking, but there's also an acknowledgement that there is a need for premium parking as well. And I think this was covered in, Mr. Witchell's evidence also.
Indeed it was, yes. And we put a paper before the inquiry, INQ 052, which pointed to the very substantial increase in premium parking that the parking strategy produces, and not a huge increase in low-cost parking, which of course what Balfour's proposal would achieve.
Sorry, I've just got to. I think I reject that. I can't accept that point. This proposal makes provision for 2,700 spaces which are low cost, so provided to the south of the airport site. It then makes provision for a further multi-storey car park, so multi-storey car park 3, which will deliver net something along the lines of 1,500 spaces. So in fact, I think contrary to what you have just said, there's actually more low-cost spaces being provided than premium spaces.
Yes, indeed, that may be in numerical terms, but if the paper INQ 052 showed that the premium parking amount by the 12 million passengers was actually making up 26% of the total, whereas it's only 11% of the total at the moment. And the question has to be asked, where is all this demand coming from?
I think probably that figure there is taking into account the delivery of the further multi-storey car parks, so MSCP2, which was consented as part of the 10 million passenger per annum permission. So that's probably where that increased capacity is coming from. But that doesn't form, at least directly, part of this planning application. So it's taken into account in the parking demand study, but this application isn't making provision for those premium spaces.
No, but we're looking at the situation with 12 million passengers per annum. Anyway, I think we could perhaps better move on from this. I'd like to take you to page 95 of your proof, and paragraph 5427. And that makes it clear. It's about 2/3 of the way down the page.
Yes, I'm there. Yep.
Good. Now that makes it clear that the options on site in the Greenbelt that you looked at were decked car parking south side and year-round use of the existing seasonal car park. You didn't look at the redistribution of car parking as proposed by Balfour, did you?
Not as part of the parking strategy, though I obviously have considered it in my proof of evidence and rejected it.
Yes. And you say at 5430, no other suitable options within the airport site were identified, and you're satisfied that this remains the case. Now, Balfour's solution may not be a panacea for avoiding expansion into the green belt, but in deferring or reducing the green belt impact, it must have merit, mustn't it? And therefore undermines your very special circumstances argument.
Well, I think 2 points. One, again, where the staff car park is located was a matter for the 10 MIFA application, so isn't terribly relevant here. And secondly, according to your figures, and I haven't checked them, that would may possibly create 400 additional spaces, but that wouldn't negate the need for the extension to the Silver Zone car park?
No, I said it wouldn't be a panacea, but it might, taken together with other changes in the future, be helpful. Let me move forward to page 99 of your proof at 5443. Where you're introducing the monitor and manage approach to releasing car parking.
Yes.
Facilities only being brought forward as and when demand for them arises. So it seems to me that with that approach, there is even more reason for Balfour's option to be taken seriously. For example, if planning permission is granted and the monitor and managed review of parking suggested that there was a need for more low-cost parking, but there was not yet the demand for MSCP 2 or 3. Then Balfour's proposal fits very neatly with that strategy.
I just not quite follow it, probably the time of the day. Not quite following that point. There's still a demand for the low-cost parking provision that would need to be provided in the Silver Zone car park extension.
But if your your annual review said, well, we predict, for example, that there might be a need for 500 or 1,000 more low-cost parking spaces next year in the peak, then the use of the staff car park for passenger car parking would make good sense, would it not?
I think just to be clear, I have confidence in the findings of the parking demand study and the parking demand study update and the work that Mr. Witchels has done to validate that assessment. And I consider that there is a need for both facilities. There might be an issue of timing in terms of when those facilities come forward and which facility comes first, although at this stage we anticipate it will be the Silver Zone car park, but both facilities will ultimately be required.
Yes, but looking at it another way, using the current staff car park, 1,400 of the additional 2,700 low-cost car parking spaces proposed in the Silver Zone extension could be provided with no setting up cost, and the 1,000 spaces taken by staff north side, which you say would be using other the more expensive parking spaces, would stimulate demand for additional car parking in the multi-storey car park. So isn't the prospect of reallocating staff car parking a win for the airport and for Greenbelt policy?
I don't think so, because wouldn't we lose the spaces, the premium spaces to the north of the airport site? So presumably you would need to use some of the spaces, for example, in multi-storey car park 1.
Well, we're not suggesting that the staff should go any particular place north side, but what I have been saying to you up to now is that whilst there's clearly a demand for low-cost parking, you refer to that several times in your proof, the demand for premium parking isn't as strong, and therefore if you take out parking in north side for staff, you're likely to stimulate demand for building the next multi-storey car park.
I
Isn't that a
I still
reasonable?
don't follow. I think that I think there's a point here that we need to think about peak demand. And my understanding is that, you know, in the peak summer months, the multi-storey car park 1 does operate near capacity, as do some of the other car parks to the north of the airport site. So I think that would potentially create an issue, because you'd be, you know, if we moved 1,000 spaces from the south to the north to create additional premium level car parking, then we'd face capacity constraints to the north. So I'm just not following the argument.
Well, I think your evidence on demand north side and Balfour's evidence is in conflict. Balfour's survey showed significant spaces available in the multi-storey car park, and of course it is difficult at this present time to ascertain what the situation is, because staff are parking in multi-storey car park 1 and there is still space available there, but I think we should move.
So just quickly on that point, just so inspectors are aware, I think I probably referred to this in my evidence actually, or certainly Mr. Witchell's does. But I think the occupancy figures that you've referred to are average occupancy figures, and not peak demand. And it's peak demand that drives the capacity requirements. So I think that's one of the reasons why the figures are slightly different. And also I think it's the timing of the survey. I think the figures that you have referred to are around the time that MSCP1 opened, and as you probably expect from a new facility, the use of that was lower then, but my understanding is that, and I think I do refer to this in my rebuttal, that between May 2019 and February 2021, I think they were operating a capacity, I think it peaked at around 90%, which suggests to me that even before we reach 10 million passengers per annum, let alone 12, there's very little residual capacity to the north of the airport site.
Well, I think just for clarity, the Balfour survey was taken at midday, so it wasn't an average, it was at a point in the day, which may not have been the actual peak, but it was building to peak. But let me just move, I think we better move on from there, because I think we've perhaps dealt with that in some depth. Now, you say that the restriction on the use of the seasonal car park between May and October is an inefficient use of land. That's your page, paragraph 5438 at page 98.
Yes, that's correct.
You expressed the view that year-round use of the existing seasonal car park would enable peak demand to be met without the need for significant additional built development. And this is what the Balfour proposal could help to do, isn't it?
But I come back to the same point, that it wouldn't negate the need for the development of the Silver Zone car park.
Okay, well, let's have a look at your rebuttal there, page 33, paragraph 433. And this comes back to a point that you've made earlier, where you consider the option put forward by Balfour of gaining an extra 1,400 low-cost spaces. Have you got that?
So did you say paragraph
4.3? Yes, I think that is page 33.
I don't know if I'm I don't know if I'm on the right page. Apologies.
hang on.
Paragraph 4.3.3 of my rebuttal, it starts on this basis. Is that the paragraph you're referring to?
Sorry, I'm going to have to look at my copy. I'm sorry, this is hurtling back and not being
No, that's absolutely
fully
fine. It's fine.
prepared. This is in relation to Balpa. If only I can see where I'm referring to. I think the point I was going to ask you about is that you're talking about insufficient space for staff to park north side, and of course this is referring to 12 million passengers. And as I said earlier, Balpa proposal is not prescribing where north side staff should park. There are clearly areas in the north side which are more in demand than others, particularly, for example, areas that are furthest from the terminal, which tend to be least heavily used. Now, as the Balpa proposal would simply transfer a block of parking from one side to the other, where BAL proposes to intensify development to respect Greenbelt policy, I don't understand why you should say there would be no space available, nor that this would be taking away premium spaces, because these are the least spaces in demand.
There's still higher cost spaces relative to what are provided in the Silver Zone car park, though.
Well, Mr. Hatton's evidence demonstrated, and it wasn't disputed in cross-examination, that it would not cost the airport any more in terms of the opportunity cost and the savings in staff transport costs.
I mean, I think that's probably transport evidence, and I haven't looked at that in detail or analysed the figures, I'm afraid.
Well, can you see any reason why there would be a shortage of spaces if spaces were simply transferred from one part of the airport to another to generate more low-cost spaces where they're needed?
I just think it comes back to my point around there being a need for premium and a need. There's two markets that are being catered for, and one is premium and one is low cost. So, as I said before, transferring those spaces from the south to the north, those staff spaces, yes, it may create more low cost spaces, but it will lose premium spaces, which are all, we know, our parking demand study shows that all of the capacity is needed once the airport reaches 12 million passengers per annum.
But your parking demand study doesn't show this at all. It simply shows an overall total. It doesn't divide this into premium or long stay or low cost. But your evidence, I take you to 5434, 5435, 5437, 5449, and 5464 keeps referring to the increased demand for low-cost parking. There's no reference to how much premium parking is required.
There's a total capacity requirement of 4,200 spaces. That's the total capacity requirement. So moving spaces from the south to the north is just displacing spaces, but we do need to provide premium spaces as well once the airport reaches 12 million passengers per annum. And I've stated some of the occupancy figures there between May and 2019 and February 2021 that demonstrates that the north side of the car, under normal circumstances, obviously not currently, under normal circumstances, the multi-storey car parks, for example, are operating near peak capacity, around 90% at peak.
Well, the times you chose, if I'm not mistaken, were during the COVID pandemic. So what is that going to tell us?
I don't think May 2019 was during the pandemic.
I thought you said to something 19 to May 21.
May 2019, sorry, to February. I think it's February 2020, actually, not 21. Sorry, that was my error. But yeah, so basically, I referred to it anyway in my proof. I'd have to find, in my rebuttal, I'd have to find the exact figures there. But it is, the data shows that it's, the north side of the airport, those car parks do operate near capacity at peak. So I just come back, I don't think we're going to reach agreement on this point, but I think, there is a need to provide two types of car parking, low cost to the south and then premium parking to the north. There's a total requirement for 4,200 spaces, and that's what's been identified.
I've accepted that. I have accepted that previously in evidence. What I haven't accepted is the distribution between low cost and premium parking. I think the inspectors will be well aware of that, so I think we'll be able to finish at that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Renshaw. Mr. Humphreys, is there any re-examination on that cross-examination?
I'm just going to ask about one point. The two documents I'm going to touch on, one of them is going to be easier for you to get to, so I'll ask you to go to that one. Go to the MPPF. And turn to PDF page 16. And paragraph 56 sets out the very familiar test for planning conditions.
Yes.
Now, I won't get you to read, to look up the other document, but in Mr. Renshaw's evidence, section 8.4 at the very end of it sets out the things that Balfour is seeking. The two alternatives. One is a proposed draft planning condition. That is that within 6 months of the grant or outline planning permission, I think should be of outline planning permission, it shall be demonstrated to the satisfaction of the council that the staff parking, which is not related to the airport administrative building, has been relocated to the Greenbelt inset area. Does that comply with the requirement for a proper planning condition?
No, I would argue that it doesn't meet those tests, that it's necessary, and for the reasons I've set out, relevant to the development.
Mr. Renshaw has an alternative. His paragraph 8.4.3, proposed unilateral undertaking. Alternatively, it is considered that this could be achieved by a unilateral undertaking by Bristol Airport Limited under section 106. This would commit BAL to the relocation of staff parking, which is not related to the airport's administrative building, to the north side within a period of 6 months from the grant of planning permission. Does that meet the test in paragraph 57 of the MPPF for planning obligations?
No, a similar point, but no, it doesn't meet in my view, doesn't meet the planning obligation test that are set out at para 57 of this document.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Humphreys, and thank you again, Mr. Melling.
Mr. Humphreys, it's 4:25. I don't want to sit later tn 5:15, really. you've had about 50 minutes, so I appreciate it's slightly awkward.
Of course. Let me just sort of slightly rearrange things again. Mr. Gertler, good afternoon again.
Good afternoon.
We were considering the making best use or making better use policy, and we looked at it in the APF. I just wanted to touch on it now in the document that we've been referring to as MBU, and I was just about to start, I think, at page 4 of the document, and paragraph 1.1, by just agreeing the fact with you that the policy as expressed in the MBU document is, as we can see, the continuation of, or the rolling forward of, a very long-standing policy. And indeed, you made the point earlier that it even went back as far as the Air Transport White Paper 2003, the even earlier document.
Yes.
And if we look at page 10, again, you were taken to this, and I assure you we'll talk about weight and balance and everything else. But first, just wanting to understand what the policy is. Again, we can see in paragraph 1.29 that the policy itself is absolutely clear. There's a very clear restatement there of the policy that the government is supportive of airports beyond Heathrow making best use of their existing runways. We'll come on later to the caveats and balance, but the basic theme of policy that government is supportive of that is clear, isn't it? It's part of a long-standing theme of government policy.
It is stated in that first paragraph, first sentence, that is the case. And as you said, there are then caveats, and arguably throughout MBU there are issues of uncertainty raised.
We will explore those in different parts of the cross-examination, but I'm just...
But yes, that is used by airport operators probably on every single planning application that has gone in for increased capacity as the basis behind that application.
It's a very long, very well-established policy, isn't it?
This is 2018, yes.
Well, this one, but the theme, as you say, goes back to 2003.
It was mentioned in there.
Yes.
The words were used in that document.
Now,
I don't think you could say MBU as such was a policy back in that. Obviously, the Air Transport White Paper had very, very specific recommendations for different airports.
right. Now, you make the point, so we'll touch on probably weight in 2 or 3 places, but I want to give you an opportunity to talk about it early on. you make the point that clearly, and we can see it on page 6 of the policy, that at the time government was producing this policy document, the carbon target in section 1.1 of the Climate Change Act was the 80% target and not the 100% target. And that, together obviously with the sixth carbon budget, is the basis on which you attack the weight to be given to policy.
Could you rephrase that? We'll say it again, please.
Yes. We can see in the document that it was clearly published, promulgated at a time when the target in the Climate Change Act was an 80% reduction. We know that has changed. We know you've drawn attention, relied on it to the sixth carbon budget, and that, as I understand it, is the basis on which you challenge the weight to be attached to the policy.
The sixth carbon budget.
I think you can just say yes to this, probably.
Okay,
Can't you?
yes.
Yeah. Okay,
The sixth
thanks.
carbon budget, and sorry, yes, the sixth carbon budget is part of it, and net zero with the 100% for 2050.
Yeah, the
is
two things
also-
I just put to you. So yes.
Okay, yes.
Good.
Yes, sorry.
Clearly, government could, because government's aware of those things. After all, those are two things that government has done. Could have revoked the policy.
It could have revoked the policy, but if you look at MBU, it's constantly referring, and it's been incredibly slow, but it's constantly referring to the aviation strategy. And the aviation strategy hasn't
I'm not asking you
materialised yet.
about what it's referring to, Mr. Gertler.
But
government could have revoked the policy. It could just have said we are suspending
but-
this policy or revoking the policy, and it's not done that, has it?
But this is 2018 and we're now in 2021. I imagine that it anticipated that the aviation strategy, well, it did anticipate. It told us when the
Could
aviation
it
strategy...
have revoked the
And
policy?
I said it could have revoked the policy.
Okay. What it has done instead, we know, is it has reaffirmed the policy on a number of occasions and told us, told the world, that it should have full effect.
It does say full effect. That doesn't necessarily mean full weight.
Yes, I think in the Middle Ages the philosophers debated the number of angels that could dance on the head of a pin. I think the inspectors know what full effect means.
This was something that you did discuss with Mr. Hinnells.
I did, Dr. Hinnells.
Dr. Hinnells, sorry.
We also know, don't we, from the DFT letter in relation to the ANPS, that's INQ 062.
Bear with me 1 second.
We don't need to go to it unless you want to. Perfectly happy to. That again, DFT there recognised that things had changed since the promulgation of that policy, but it didn't feel it appropriate or necessary to revoke, amend, or indeed review the policy.
I would like to go to it. Can you repeat the INQ?
INQ 026.
Documents. Zero, 026.
Sorry, 062.
Oh, sorry, thank you.
Sorry.
Yep,
I do apologise.
no, I realise. Yes, I recall this letter. Yep.
And although invited to trigger a Section 6 review of the policy on the basis that there has been a change, government has declined to do so.
That's specific in relation to the ANPS.
Of course it's specific in relation to the ANPS. Mr. Gertler, we're going to take ages on this. This is really not difficult. In that letter, they acknowledge things have changed, but they very clearly, we can see it from the end, have not triggered the review of policy. They do not think it appropriate to do so.
But I'd say that that is specific to the ANPS.
Yes, of course that's specific to the
ANPS.
ANPS.
It's not in relation to MBU.
No, but what that shows is, isn't it, that just because circumstances change doesn't mean that government policy changes.
But it recognises that there are significant changes since the ANPS, but in terms of the DCO process, it doesn't consider that the ANPS at this stage needs to be reviewed. It doesn't feel it meets the tests in the 2008 Act. That's my reading of it. So it isn't talking about MBU at all.
No, it's not talking about MBU. It's talking about the airport's national policy statement. I'm saying that tells us the principle, doesn't it, that just because something changes doesn't mean government policy, all government policy prior to June 2019, the date of net zero, doesn't need to be reviewed, does it?
Not all government policy, but this...
No.
That letter is really quite specific to one aspect.
And for example, the core strategy itself, the local authority's core strategy, makes it very clear. We can actually see through it. It refers to the 80% target. We're not suggesting, are you, that the core strategy should be given less weight. Clearly policy, things can change, and policy can maintain weight, can't it?
Things can change. It's the question of the weight that you give to it. So I think Mr. Taylor, I can't remember who it was in cross-examination or re-examination, made it clear that I think his example was to use housing targets, that your core strategy may have housing targets, but 5 years, 10 years on, the question of the weight you give to it has to be asked. And that,
Mr. Gertler, as you well know, that's local plan policy. We're here talking about government policy, where the government has not reviewed the policy. Could revoke at any point. It has not done so. Now, in the context where government itself has told us that full effect is to be given to the policy, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that what you seek to do is actually mount a full frontal attack on the merits of government policy. We've agreed what the policy is. We've agreed that it's currently being restated and said to have full effect, and you simply don't like it.
No, that's not the case at all.
Well, which of those things is wrong? We agreed what the words mean. Government has told us it is to have full effect, and you don't like it. Which of those don't you agree with?
I haven't agreed with you on that. I've said full effect is different to full weight.
All right. Well, fine. In a sense, the inspectors will obviously have to, form a judgment. There's little purpose me debating whether full effect means something different from weight with you. But at least we understand the differences between us. You, in your evidence, you drew attention to the MPPF policy on weight, paragraph 48. and indeed also on prematurity,
Yes.
those paragraphs, that policy is very clearly different, isn't it? There's no analogy to be drawn on the weight to be attached to a local plan on the one hand and the weight to be attached to government's own policy on the other. Those are quite different things.
No, I was looking at principle. I do accept that it says local plan, emerging. It does talk about emerging plan. I would say that the principles of whether, in terms of paragraph 48,
Well, which bit of 48 are you relying on?
I'm saying there is an analogy.
No, which bit of 48 are you relying on?
I've looked at the issues of the extent.
Are you able to answer which bit of 48
Yeah.
you're relying on?
I went through it before. That I have said that this is about, although this is about local plans, that you can apply the same principle.
Yes, which bit? You've got 3 sub-bits. Which bit?
Well, unresolved objections to relevant policies. You give greater weight. At the moment, that is the stage where
Which unresolved objection is there to MBU?
the government has carried out the consultation on the Jet Zero.
Yeah, we're not talking about Jet Zero. We're talking about MBU.
Sorry,
this long-established policy.
Okay. I was sorry, I was talking about Jet Zero.
Focus your mind on the ABF and MBU.
Yep.
Is there anything in there that you want to rely on? If there is, point me to it. If there isn't, let's just pass on.
Yeah. I would like to, can you take me to the footnote, which is, I can't remember the document, it's in footnote.
Could be.
Because I don't recall either in Mr. Gertler's evidence, written evidence, or indeed his evidence in chief, him suggesting that paragraph 48 should be applied to NBU or the APF. He only relied upon paragraph 48 in the context of the Jet Zero consultation. So I think the question's being put on a misunderstanding. But
I would have thought it's almost the other way round, isn't it? I've asked the question. The simple answer would be, I'm not relying on this at all.
For MBU, I'm not.
You're not?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Well, Mr. Taylor's right, and earlier on I said to you, I was talking about Jet Zero. I'd misunderstood.
Okay. Now, there's nothing at all in the MPPF, is there? And nothing's been cited in your evidence, no authorities or anything else, about the basis on which less weight should be applied to government policy?
No, I've not cited anything on that.
Talking then about balancing benefits with effect, so just moving now to a slightly different theme, I'm sure we'll touch on MBU again at some point, but balancing benefits with impacts, again, it's very clear, isn't it, from all the policy documents that there has to be, for the aviation sector, a balance of the benefits of aviation and its costs, and those costs would include those relating to climate change.
Yes.
And you, in CD 6.1, this time on page 55.
Sorry, just.
Para 3.3, this is the Paran. I'm using it again as an exemplar of balance. There are many, as an example, there are many examples in the documents, but this is the one that talks about striking a fair balance between negative impacts of noise on health, amenity, etc., and productivity, and positive economic impacts. As a general principle, the government expects future growth to ensure benefits are shared between the aviation industry and local communities. There's no definition there, is there, of what is meant by local communities?
There's no definition, but if you refer back to 3.1, you have borne by those living around airports.
Yes, there's no definition of those living around airports. Clearly, those matters, what are the relevant communities, will be different for whether you're talking about an air noise impact or an air quality impact, which might be very local to proximity to a road, or an economic impact, which will clearly be wider. Weston-super-Mare is a local community, isn't it, in terms of economic impacts, for example?
In terms of what? Sorry, in terms of if there was a
Economic
proposed
impacts.
if there was a proposed development here, or
In terms of
Well,
the
you-
airport,
the
Mr.
airport.
Gertler.
there should be economic benefits to.
No, didn't ask whether there should be economic benefits. It's a local community. The concept of local communities isn't some fixed ring, is it? It will clearly depend upon what one's considering.
It will depend on what you're considering,
Yeah.
but I put it to you that Dr. Piper and Mr. Brass took a very wide approach. Their lowest was to come down to NSC level.
Yes, but you're not saying that there aren't health and economic benefits for the very local community, are you?
I'm saying that there are more disbenefits for the local community.
Didn't ask you about the disbenefits.
I'm not saying there aren't benefits. I'm saying that they haven't been defined. Dr.
No.
Piper didn't get down to that level.
But clearly, you can look at benefits and you can decide, you know, the extent to which they relate to a particular community or a district or so on. But you're not saying that benefits beyond that constraint of what you regard as a local community don't count or aren't important. Of course
No,
they are.
I'm not saying that they aren't.
No, they also have to be weighed in the balance, don't they?
You would, yes.
Of course they do. And therefore, to sort of atomize the assessment and say, oh, well, you haven't proved precisely whether these people precisely here have got a benefit, there's no policy basis for that because there's no definition of what local communities are.
But it's not been assessed, and they accept that they haven't. So there are impacts on
Yes.
the immediate community.
But, Mr. Gertler, you're doing what the Council has done so much in this case. You set up a straw man. You create something which you say we're supposed to do, and then you say we haven't done it, and there's no assessment. There was no requirement from officers, was there, when we were carrying out all these assessments to assess precisely a small band? Officers were perfectly happy with the assessments.
Yes, officers, there is nothing to say that officers requested a further assessment.
And this is just an example of where the new case has developed completely consistently with everything we discussed with the Council previously.
I'm not convinced it's a new case.
All right.
You've got consultants who've been asked to look at the planning application from their different backgrounds, their expertise, and to comment on it from that point of view.
We can agree, can't we, that when one's looking at these concepts of sharing the benefits or balancing benefits and impacts, it's not necessary in that context for the benefits and the impacts to be shared by exactly the same people.
No, but it's got to be fair and balanced.
But clearly with an infrastructure project, indeed a lot of very large projects, even if they aren't infrastructure, almost inevitably they will have impacts which are very proximate to the boundaries of the development. But if they are infrastructure, whether it's a generating station or a sewage treatment works or an airport or a bus station, their benefits will be much wider. That's why we have infrastructure. And planning inspectors have to balance those things overall, don't they?
Planning inspectors do have to. Ultimately, planning inspectors
Yes.
will be making the decision.
And you're not, I don't think, suggesting that just because a benefit might not be a benefit to the very same person that's suffering a noise impact, that that benefit shouldn't properly be weighed in the balance.
I'm suggesting that there is, if you're using noise, there is more of a disbenefit to the local community than there is any form of benefit from it. And then
Yes.
that is shown in the lack of mitigation or the inadequate mitigation
Yes.
for that community.
I'm not pressing you one way or the other, but just to be sure how you've taken it into account, do you accept that those local impacts are properly weighed against benefits, some of which may be very local, depending on how you define local, but others will be much more widespread, especially in the case of infrastructure?
Yes, there will be different benefits.
Yeah, I know there will be different benefits. Do you recognise, do you understand
I'll-
that it's proper to balance
I'll-
those things and
yes,
take
ultimately-
wider benefits into account?
Ultimately, it is up to the decision maker to weigh.
I know it's up to the decision maker. Do you accept that it is proper to take those into account?
I accept it is proper to take the benefits into account and the disbenefits as well.
Of
And
course.
it's the fair balance.
Now, in terms of national versus local issues, again, and we can look at APF and we can look at MBU, do you accept that climate change as an issue is in policy terms regarded as a national or indeed global issue?
Climate change obviously is a global issue.
And we are agreed, I suspect, that in CD 6.4, the MBU
The which? MBU.
page 6, PDF page 6, paragraph 1.11, that having looked on the previous page at the role of local planning and noise and matters of that sort, contrast that in paragraph 1.11 to say there are, however, contrast, some important environmental elements which should be considered at a national level. The government recognises that airports making best use of their existing runways could lead to increased air traffic, which could increase carbon emissions, as an example of things to be considered at a national level. So do we agree that that is one of the issues that needs to be considered at a national level?
Part of our evidence has been that
Didn't ask what part of your evidence had been. Are we agreed that climate change as an issue is something to be considered at the national level?
it is a national issue. The government has to set policy at a national level on climate change.
And government's perfectly entitled, isn't it, to have a policy that says that climate change should be dealt with at a national level.
It's entitled to say that.
And indeed it has similar policy with other things that relate to national issues. For example, with motor vehicles and phasing out petrol and diesel cars, that's not left to local authorities. That's dealt with at a national level, isn't it?
Yes and no. But yes, obviously there can be national statements, national objectives, and at the local level, then there are obviously issues such as if you look at the core strategy, the policy CS1, and then if you look at the planning conditions that are being proposed, there are obviously things as well that the local planning authority can seek to achieve to reduce climate change impacts, to, for instance, on your car issue, the electric charging, the promotion, you get electric charging points being encouraged in development. So those kind of things, yes, whilst there may be a national approach and the government saying by 2030 or whatever, it won't be producing new diesel vehicles, at the local level you can also then have policies to address that. Sorry, to improve the environmental impacts, to improve energy efficiency.
And in relation to climate change, so different issue now, but just touching on climate change, you make it very clear in your evidence at paragraph 193. Dr. Hinnells makes exactly the same point in his evidence at paragraph 70-71. So your paragraph 193 and 194, you identify there the appropriate policy test for the inspectors to adopt.
Yes, I say in 94 it is.
Sorry, 193 and 194.
I say in paragraph 194 that
yes,
it is
and
the
Dr.
appropriate
Hinnell
test.
said, and Dr. Hinnell said exactly the same. Madam, could I be allowed, I think probably 15 minutes would do it, just to find a more sensible break than this break. I want to then, Mr. Gertler, just touch on two further themes, this time in your evidence. And the first is your concept of headroom. And you touch on this at your paragraph 97. This is part of the striking a fair balance point and sharing benefits. And you use this in paragraph 100 to introduce the concept of headroom. And can we agree that the quotation in your paragraph 97 that we looked at earlier, firstly, it's made clear, isn't it, that that approach is to be applied as a general principle. It's not a development control policy, is it?
Sorry, can you say the paragraph again?
In your evidence,
yep.
Paragraph 97.
In relation to noise?
Just in relation to the paragraph there. Just have a look at it. Makes it very clear that the approach to striking the fair balance, and then as a general principle, expects growth should ensure benefits are shared between the industry and communities. That's a general principle, isn't it? It's not a development control policy, obviously.
It is a general principle.
And government doesn't here indicate what the sharing should be. That will clearly depend on the circumstances.
Yes.
And we know from APF that the government recognises, in relation to noise, that some changes will adversely affect the noise environment, paragraph 3.28. So the government isn't here setting down some hard-edged rule, is it, that the expansion of airports cannot increase noise. This is a general principle.
It is
an
a general,
objective.
An objective, did you say?
Yes.
Yes.
When in your paragraph 100 you tell us that this produces some sort of headroom, there's no basis, is there, for the translation of what is a broad principle for the aviation industry into a concept of headroom to be applied beyond which something becomes unacceptable?
It is a general principle.
Yes.
And
there's no basis, is there, for that concept to become one of headroom within which one must keep?
It goes back to the question of the fair balance. So you have in here, I mean, it's right at the beginning, sorry, I'm not speaking into the microphone, it's right at the beginning of the paragraph, and it says, strike a fair balance between the negative impacts of noise and the economic impacts of flight.
Yes, precisely that. There will be some negative impacts, and you balance them against the positive economic impacts. The concept of environmental headroom, that there's some sort of limit, and if you go beyond that in terms of noise, that is unacceptable. There's no basis for that, is there?
But there is, it says, as noise levels fall with technology improvements, the aviation industry should be expected to share the benefits from their improvements, these improvements.
We're agreeing on that. Do you want to do it now? Do you want to point me to anything that says there is a concept of headroom beyond which something is unacceptable?
Using the term headroom is useful to indicate, or I've used it to indicate that you've got a target, you've got the principle, and then you've got the impacts that you're trying to address as well.
All right. We know that in fact, in terms of air noise, the air noise impacts of the airport are forecast to be well within the envelope set by the 10 MPPA planning permission.
But we also know from the 20...
Do we know that the impacts are well within that envelope, that headroom?
They're within the envelopes of the 2011 permission, but it was shown in evidence that those are never going to be achieved. That is, if you go back to two things that I said in evidence in chief, I think it's two. One is that it's got to be realistic. It was accepted in evidence on the noise that there is no way that with the fleet mix, with the proposals, with the growth, that the 2011 targets are going to be achieved. And then in some of the evidence I gave, the government talked about not doing things in the same way as it had done in the past, so that you move on. It's got to be fairer. We've got to progress. So there is no point relying on a condition that allows a very large area to adversely affect...
It was a condition that your clients thought
But that was back in 2011.
Of course.
And things have moved on, and your noise consultants has accepted that under any mix and growth, it's not going to hit those targets. It would be the same with, say, the Heathrow noise contours, which at one point had Concorde in them. You know, it's got to be fairer. We've got to move on. The 2011 contour is not relevant anymore.
Well, you may feel that. What it does show, though, is that there is continuing improvement, that the current contours are much smaller than those that were thought acceptable earlier. Can we agree that at least?
The contours with or without development are better than in the condition, but the condition contours are never going to be achieved.
Can we then just deal with one last issue before we break? And I just want to understand and examine the way in which you use the making better use or making best use policy in the APF and the MBU. So we've discussed what they are. I want to understand now how you use them. And you make this position very clear in a number of places, and indeed in your evidence in chief. I think I've counted up 5 or 6 places in which you make the point, but let's look at, as an example, paragraph 95. And your paragraph 95 says this: it follows that in determining a planning application for a scheme, to make use of an existing runway, it is only once it has been demonstrated that the benefits of the scheme outweigh its costs that the APF, I think the same would apply to MBU, provides policy support which weighs in favour of the proposed development in the planning balance. So in other words, you carry out a balancing exercise first of all, and it's only when you finish that planning balance exercise that you say MBU, making best use, whether it's in the APF or MBU, becomes an applicable consideration. Now, and from your evidence in chief, my understanding was that even when at that deferred stage it becomes a consideration, at that point, so after the planning balance, at that point you would then apply limited weight to it. Did I understand that correctly?
I don't think I've understood you, I'm afraid.
Okay. Look in your evidence, there are multiple places. The end of paragraph 94, it is only if it is demonstrated that the benefits of a proposal to increase the use of the runways outweigh costs so that APF will provide support. Same point 95, it's only once it's been demonstrated that benefits outweigh costs that the APF provides policy support which weighs in favour. I think you have it again at paragraph 106. I've read this as being consistent. Yeah, top of page 29, where it says established that such development is acceptable on its merits, the benefits outweigh the costs. In other words, to obtain the benefit support of MBU, it has to be established that the benefits of the proposal outweigh its costs. What's very clear from multiple places in your evidence, that you're saying you carry out a balancing exercise and, quote, it is only once it is demonstrated that benefits outweigh impacts that you engage making best use. Have I understood that correctly? Correct me if I've got it wrong.
But yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I thought it was. I didn't think it was too difficult. Now, the consequence of that, let's just work that through in the 2 alternatives. There are two ways that plays out. Firstly, if costs outweigh benefits, which is your case, if the costs of the development outweigh the benefits on your planning balance, where you have not included MBU as part of that, then of course you never actually apply MBU with any weight at all, full, limited, anything, because it's only once benefits outweigh costs that you apply MBU. Have I understood that correctly?
I don't think so.
Well, what do the words only once benefits outweigh costs mean?
Well, what I've said, what I'm saying in that, so you took me to 106, is that I don't believe MBU provides unqualified.
That's a different point. That's a point on the interpretation of what MBU means. What I'm very keen to understand, and I could understand if it appeared here once, but it appears in multiple places where you make this point, and you've agreed to me that is the point. Look at 89, for example, 3 lines from the bottom. Again, support of the APF for airport scheme can only, underlined, be obtained once it is established that the benefits of the scheme outweigh the impacts. Only, underlined. And what I'm asking you is, therefore, in circumstances where, as you say, the benefits do not outweigh the costs, I assume, because you can only apply them if they do, that you don't apply MBU at all.
In the circumstances where benefits
Oh,
don't
Mr.
help.
Gertler, this is not really very difficult.
So you said in the circumstances where benefits...
Your argument is that the costs outweigh the benefits.
Yes.
Yeah. My understanding from these multiple places in this section of your evidence and the way it then translates into your planning balance is that because you weigh the planning balance the way you do, costs outweighing benefits, you never get to apply MBU because it only applies if the benefits are greater than the costs. That's why you've underlined the word only.
I have, that is what I'm saying.
Okay. Now, that means that the inspectors need to understand, don't they, that in the way you have weighed the planning balance, in the section right at the end of your evidence, that it's not a question of you applying less weight to MBU. As you told you don't apply MBU at all. You can't do because you only apply it if the planning balance is in favour of the development. That's why it's underlined, only.
I do apply MBU. Every single application comes forward for airport expansion with MBU.
No, don't want to know about other applications for airport expansion. Just asking about your approach here. Not pressing you one way or the other.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify what you've done so that the inspectors understand it.
I've said that MBU needs to be taken into account where the benefits outweigh the cost.
Where the benefits outweigh the costs. But in your case, you say the costs outweigh the benefits. What I'm putting to you is, my understanding is, because of your explanation, therefore you don't ever apply MBU because the costs outweigh the benefits.
I'm struggling. I'm sorry. I'm struggling to understand because clearly MBU comes into play. MBU is being advanced as the reason for taking this forward, that it's government policy, and I've considered MBU, and
So, should the inspectors conclude, therefore, that when in paragraph 89, the word only underlined, paragraph 87, the word only underlined, 94, only, 95, only once, 106, same point, that's not the right approach, that MBU does become material, even if costs outweigh the benefits. You can't have it both ways. I don't mind which way you jump. Just jump.
No, sorry, I've said it. you were correct the first time. So, as you said in 89, or as I've said in 89, the support for APF for an airport scheme is only attained once it's established the benefits
Right.
outweigh the cost, outweigh the impacts.
Okay. And therefore, in your planning balance, the inspectors need to note that you do not apply, or you do not apply any policy support from MBU. It's not applied because of the way you've used the policy in these paragraphs.
So in terms of MBU, I would say two things. One, I think...
But by MBU, I mean making best use. I don't mind whether it's in the APF or the MBU policy. I'm just talking about that policy support for government that you make better use of runways.
So there has to be limited support because it's not showing that the benefits of the scheme are outweighing the impacts.
Okay. Well, inspectors can make what they like of all of that. Let's just look at the flip side of this. If the benefits did outweigh the costs, you say again, it's only then that you would apply the making best use policy. But of course, if the benefits outweigh the costs, it's redundant at that stage, isn't it? The benefits have already outweighed the costs.
No, then, I mean...
You don't need extra policy support if the benefits have outweighed the costs.
It says make best use of existing capacity, but it does have the weighing up against the environmental disbenefits. So MBU says make best use of existing capacity, but it does say the fair balance, and it does have the subject to, and provided that. So
you see, when I read your evidence, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, happy to be told I'm wrong, it seemed that like a central plank of government policy, making best use of runways, played no part in the way you have assessed the planning balance. Indeed, could not play a part, because if costs outweigh benefits, you don't ever get to MBU, and if benefits outweigh costs, MBU is just redundant. You've already won. You're telling me that that's one should not read all these paragraphs in that way.
I'm saying that MBU, making better use of existing capacity, is government policy.
Right.
And then...
And it does get weighed in the planning balance?
But subject, yes, and it's got subject to the benefits needing to outweigh the costs associated with it. And that's, I mean, it says subject to, and it says provided that.
Sorry to, I think we're starting to go round in
circles
a little bit here, and we are past 15:15.
I know. I've just got one, I think, question I just want to ask, but is, is from my perspective, as I say, I don't mind where the witness goes. I just want to understand what these paragraphs with only if, what that means. The BAL approach is that the APF, the MBU, that gives policy support to expansion and indeed the economic and social benefits it brings, but that those in the planning balance, so you put benefits and everything else on this one side, and MBU is part of that. We're expanding in accordance with that policy, and you then weigh that against the disbenefits, noise and anything else. Am I now right in understanding that that is what you say is the correct approach?
Sorry, that's not what it's not what I've understood BAL's approach to be. BAL's approach is to say MBU says that we can increase capacity, almost full stop, and
that's plainly not the case.
And then
so, in the BAL case, you would take into account the benefits, policy support for that and making best use and you know, economic benefits and all those things go in one side of the planning balance, and on the other side of the planning balance go the impacts. Do you accept that that is the correct approach?
I accept that there's got to be the planning balance, yes.
I know there's got to be a planning balance, Mr. Gertler. Come on, it's late.
It is late. I'm struggling to understand. MBU is government policy which says...
I know that. Look, what I've just put to you 2 or 3 times is, in the balance, it seemed that what you were saying here is that you balance costs and benefits, and only once you've determined that, you then look at MBU. What I'm saying, our approach is, that we say is correct, that you look at the benefits. MBU is part of that, making better use. We would be making better use of the runway. You take that and you weigh all of those things, and then you weigh against that the impacts. And I'm just asking you, do you accept that's the right approach?
I would accept that. You have to weigh the benefits.
Do you accept that's the right approach? Just yes would be enough. No.
Well, I'm you know, I thought
you
I
must know.
Sorry?
Please.
Yeah, I think it's a fairly straightforward
Yeah, well,
question.
I thought I'd answered it a number of times.
Well, then
but-
just answer it again.
but, okay, yes, then...
Thank you. Hallelujah.
Right, okay. Is there anything? Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone. We'll reconvene at 9:30 tomorrow. Thank you.